So the true history of the United States of America. This should make for an interesting story to tell. When the civilization of Lemuria came out of the fourth age of man into the current fifth age of man, about 14,000 years ago, their elders decided that they were best left alone from the rest of the world for the most part. A very rigid, very orderly society, very benevolent by nature. But one of the things that was inherent in their culture was having small families. Families with more than two children were basically unheard of. 1 to 2 children per couple was the norm in the society. And they existed on this island nation in the Southern Ocean for about 8,000 years. About 3,000 to 4,000 years before the current era, this society realized that they were becoming susceptible to the global rise in sea level that was occurring at the time. Very large polar ice caps that were calving large icebergs into the water. And when these large chunks of ice would be let go and fall into the ocean, it would cause catastrophic tidal waves around the world. And these could travel thousands of miles. One of the ones that in the end really was kind of the final blow to Lemuria was reported in India in their histories. So these were events that affected a great many people around the world at the time. They all had different explanations within their respective cultures for what was happening. But those on Lemuria were more advanced, per se, than many of their peers around the globe, at least during those days. And they were great mariners. They were very good at navigating the oceans, and they did this for the purpose of establishing trade. They sought to obtain these goods, these things from various points around the globe on a regular basis. But that did not work both ways. They did not export anything. Their individuals would go and live among these other societies to ensure that these systems of trade were not interrupted. And the people of Lemuria lived a very comfortable existence, especially by the standards of the time. Now, as the Earth's weather, average mean temperature, was changing, it was causing the polar ice caps to let go some of that ice. And as these large glaciers would release these large, and when I say large, I mean bigger than anything that's occurred in modern time, en masse being released into the ocean would create gigantic tidal waves that the effects of which were felt obviously thousands of miles away. Now, many of these cultures at the time were not formally intertwined. Formal communication was not established, and they each came up in their respective cultures with different myths and lore surrounding these events. But those on Lemuria understood that their island nation in the South Seas and the Southern Indian Ocean was particularly susceptible to these large releases of ice and the devastation that would ensue. So began about 3,000 to 4,000 years before the current era, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, a mass migration away from this island nation. And in various areas around the globe, these individuals came to live. And the table was set, so to speak, for them, because they already had individuals from their society established as individuals who were very prominent in the field of trade via the sea. Now, the kingdoms into which these individuals became settled, they were guests in these kingdoms. They were very wealthy, the Lemurians. They were, for the most part, welcomed into the various areas around the globe to which they fled because of their wealth, because of their knowledge, very well educated, very aware of cultural variations, and many of them were able to choose where they were wished to go. And a great many of them fled to Europe, what is now modern-day Europe. Now this sounds, I realize, shocking to some of you who think of Europe as kind of a post-Roman Empire Europe in your history. A great deal happened before the Romans conquered much of Europe. But when the Romans would conquer a respective culture, their literature, their history would be replaced with the Romans' version. And the Romans have been fighting, I guess I should step back a minute and clarify this next statement. The individuals who we in history think of as the Romans, that ruled the world for so many centuries, spawned from a group of individuals who also survived the Fourth Age. The legend of Remus and Romulus that founded Rome. There's a lot of actual history behind that legend that was passed between the Fourth and Fifth Ages of man. Many of these societies dislike each other for a litany of reasons, but the individuals that founded Rome despised the individuals from Lemuria. As these various cultures around the world became aware of each other, each with their own respective level to which they were playing with the rest of the world, through trade, through commerce, wars began to break out. There are societies, families on your planet right now who have literally been at war for thousands of years. It's a concept that is foreign to many Jaku. I feel that the reason this concept becomes foreign to you is because it's very difficult for human beings, for the most part, to believe in anything that they can't verify or see or touch or experience with one of their senses. As such, there is an inherent distrust in history that is passed down orally. People have an innate trust with the written word. Now, this has been understood since long before I got here. That's why, as I said on the long tapes that I recorded, I took some time and explained why these ancient societies carved things in stone. When you're carving something in stone, you're not just rambling off random thoughts. You're thinking very carefully about what you're putting down. And the reason why so many of these societies' languages were graphic in nature, hieroglyphics and such, was because they wanted it to be recorded in such a way that it would be easily understood by subsequent civilizations that may come long before they were there to explain what they meant when it was written. Now, the people from Lemuria existed on the underground for several thousand years this way, going from place to place around the world. They desperately wanted a new homeland. The individuals that had survived and kept this culture going believed that it was going to die out if something was not done soon. And let me think here for a moment. I would say about 500 years ago, they began a very expensive, a very carefully thought out plan to reestablish themselves as the preeminent species on this planet. Or species is not the correct term, excuse me, as the preeminent civilization on this planet. These individuals, because they understood these various respective trade routes, were very well positioned to make good business decisions, one might say. Their money grew. As their money grew, so did their power and their influence within the respective cultures or kingdoms, oftentimes back then, in which they lived. But they were always guests in someone else's home. They were never allowed to establish law, for instance. They were never allowed to openly practice the rituals that had been handed down amongst them. Now, these families retained the cultural aspect that they kept having very small families, just a couple of children. The information, the power structure itself, nothing was ever written down. Everything was passed down from generation to generation, and they would meet from time to time at great expense, traveling great distances, in order to ensure that this culture, that this way of existing, not only did not die out, but that if there was any way that they could fan these flames back to life, that could be done. They started I guess the term would be company, the East India Trading Company, these groups of individuals. And as the New World was discovered, first of all, they knew very well about both North and South America, but the cultures that existed in both North and South America, respectively, were not very good trading partners, the Lemurians believed. They collected gold in mass quantities, but they used it for religious value, not the way the Lemurians sought to use it, which was a form of payment. In other words, a piece of gold was not worth how much it weighed to these cultures. It was worth what it was molded into by these cultures. And it became very difficult for them to trade with them. They were also very isolated, both North and South America. There were great wars that took place within those respective cultures that are forgotten in history, in modern history. Societies, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, the Incans, the Mayans, those are studied now. Societies in North America, the Native American cultures, the Inuit peoples farther north, they are beginning to be studied. But these are also cultures that, for the most part, have been displaced. And their traditions and their histories passed down orally from generation to generation. That chain has been disrupted for a great many of them. And that's something for another time. I don't want to get sidetracked. I want to stay on this topic of the true history of America because I think it's fascinating, Tujaku. The Lemurians began to have a falling out with what at the time was the church in Rome. The church in Rome was kind of a transition from the Roman Empire, the same power construct, transitioned over to what now is referred to as the Catholic Church. My good friend Yeshua has some very sound disagreements with what they are doing with the power, the influence that the Roman Catholic Church has throughout the world. And he and I have indeed split up for a time. No falling out, I don't mean that. Sometimes when I speak in the Western vernacular, I say things, and splitting up in America to a lot of people means going your separate ways. Yeshua is right now in Vatican City, I would assume in high-level negotiations with the Pope or other individuals in the Catholic Church, because it's very important to Yeshi that his name not be associated with anything, I can't say anything negative because it's been associated with so much negative over the years, and it pains him so much to know about that.